In yesterday's show, I was dealing with an emailer who sent me a critique of one of my books, Is Jesus Coming Soon? And she took exception to some of my comments regarding Matthew chapter 24, specifically, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. And as I pointed out in my response to her, this generation is always used in the Gospels as a reference to the generation to whom Jesus is speaking. There are no exceptions to this. If there is an exception in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, it would be an unusual exception. I pointed out that the generation, I didn't point out, but a lot of people seem to think that generation can be translated as race. That is not the case. This was the Scofield Reference Bible took that particular position. That it says this race will not pass away until all these things take place, and this race refers to the Jewish race. In order to do that, you have to, of course, come up with a completely different interpretation of the word geneo, which in Scripture refers to generation, never refers to race. There is another Greek word refers to race. It's genos. They look the same, but they are not the same word. Then you have the problem is that this race will not pass away until all these things take place, which then infers that when all these things take place, the Jewish race passes away. That doesn't make any sense either. So people have gotten away from using the race argument, although some older commentaries stuck with that view, and there are still people out there today who use it. Most modern scholars, dispensational scholars, do not take that position. They claim that the verse should read, the generation that sees these signs will not pass away until all these things take place. That's an impossible interpretation as well, because in verse 33 we're told who sees all these signs, and it's the second person plural. It's you, it's Jesus' audience. It's that particular generation that sees these signs. And also you have to get rid of the word this, which is a near demonstrative, and add the word the. So you not only do you have to add words to the text, but you have to ignore the verse just preceding that text. And one of the points I make out when you debate somebody is that you have to know what the other side believes in order to do a good job of answering their position. It was obvious that this person who critiqued my book really didn't know that there are arguments outside of her own dispensational arguments. She's not very well read outside her particular view of eschatology. And so it's a danger that when you go in and debate somebody that you don't have kind of a heads up of what they believe. That's why in the number of debates I've done, I had no idea what my opponents believe, and it's a little scary going into a debate with that lack of knowledge. That's why in many cases these days I would like to know what somebody believes about a particular topic. I'm working on a debate right now. In fact, I just got an email confirming the debate topic. I'll tell you more about it in the near future as we solidify dates, times, and places. And I didn't really finish up yesterday when she said one of the points in Matthew chapter 24 that I missed was that the fig tree of verse 32 always has been been representative of the nation of Israel. This argument has been made before, and there's nothing in the New Testament that supports that view unless you go back to Matthew chapter 21 where Jesus curses the fig tree and he says there'll never be fruit from you again. So you can't have it both ways. You can't maintain that the fig tree represents Israel in Matthew chapter 24 and then claim that the fig tree does not represent Israel in Matthew chapter 21. And you'll note in both cases that this is the tree of Matthew chapter 24:32 is a leaves-only tree. There's no fruit on that tree. And so if you want to make the case that the fig tree represents Israel, you got to say that Jesus was simply saying there'll never be fruit on this tree again. That is, Israel will never be reconstituted as a nation. And of course, if you go to Luke's gospel, Luke says the fig tree and all the trees, and so that kind of muddies the waters as well. But what I did in order to answer her is I quoted probably one of the most famous dispensational scholars, and that's John Walvoord. And John Walvoord is very clear about this. He says, actually, while the fig tree could be an apt illustration of Israel, It is not so used in the Bible. And he quotes a couple of places in Jeremiah 24, 1 through 8, good and bad figs, and I comment, not trees, illustrate Israel in the captivity, and there's also mention of figs in 29:17. Walvoord goes on to say the reference to the fig tree in Judges 9, verses 10 and 11 is obviously not Israel. Two other trees are mentioned there. Cedars of Lebanon are also mentioned, which would be more apt illustration of Israel than the fig tree would be, although it doesn't have any fruit in the common sense of that word. Neither the reference in Matthew chapter 28, 18 through 20, which I've mentioned, nor that in Mark 11, 12 through 14 with its interpretation in 11, 20 through 26, gives any indication that is referring to Israel any more than the mountain referred to in the passage. Accordingly, while this interpretation is held by many, there is no scriptural warrant. That's what John Walvoord says. Better interpretation of this is that Christ was using a natural illustration because the fig tree brings forth new leaves late in the spring. The budding of the leaves is evidence that summer is near. And so this is kind of odd, but Jesus is simply saying that there's a short time to follow, a very short time to follow once the leaves come on a tree as to when summer comes. And so far, because of the way Israel as a nation is posited today, that happened in 1948. Here we are in 2010. This is an awfully long spring. Again, that doesn't make sense either. And what's interesting, identifying this particular generation and the dates of it and so forth, this woman who wrote said it was 1948. And you begin to see the change that takes place with a number of these prophecy books. When Tim LaHaye attempted to calculate the timing of this generation, Matthew chapter 24, he began with 1917. The first edition of his book, The Beginning of the End, which was published in 1972, this is what LaHaye wrote. Carefully putting all this together, we now recognize this strategic generation. It is the generation that sees the four-part sign of verse 7 in Matthew chapter 24, or the people who saw the First World War. We must be careful here not to be dogmatic, but it would seem that these people are witnesses to the events, not necessarily participants in them. That would suggest they were at least old enough to understand the events of 1914 through 1918, not necessarily old enough to go to war. So in 1972, Tim LaHaye wrote in The Beginning of the End, we have to calculate the generation of Matthew chapter 24, beginning with the First World War generation, 1914 through 1918. But then LaHaye writes a 1991 revised edition of The Beginning of the End, and he changes this strategic generation. It's no longer the people who saw the First World War. Quoting his book, carefully putting all this together, we now recognize this strategic generation. It's the same wording of the 1972 edition, but LaHaye does not tell us that he's changed his view. It is the generation that sees the events of 1948. Back in 1972, he says it was the generation who saw the First World War. We must be, and he says, we must be careful here not to become dogmatic, but it would seem that these people are witness to the events, not necessarily participants in them. So the change from 1917 to 1948 gave LaHaye another 50 years before this generation passes away. And of course, we saw the same thing in Hal Lindsey's book, The Late Great Planet Earth, came out in 1970, where he said Israel becoming a nation again in 1948 was extremely important. It was the identifying beginning point of this final generation. A generation in the Bible was 40 years. You add 40 to 1948 and you get 1988. We had Chuck Smith who followed a similar idea. We had the 88 reasons why the rapture is going to be in 1988. And so again, when you stick to Scripture and don't speculate, you begin to see that the Bible makes much more sense than these ideas of speculation about when Israel became a nation, whether it has anything to do with Bible prophecy today.